Hello, and welcome to Setting the Standard, the podcast about wireless radio standards creation from the Wireless Innovation Forum. I'm your host and communications director of the forum, Stephanie Hamill. Continuing our special episode on the SCA in honor of the forum's 30th anniversary, I'm talking to Kevin Richardson. Few people were more central to the development phase than Kevin, who helped navigate the practical realities of implementing SCA-based systems, bridging the gap between early concepts and deployable architectures. Thanks so much for joining me today, Kevin, to talk about the SCA.
Okay, no problem. Look forward to it.
Okay, so I talked to Dr. Matola already about the beginning of the SCA, and I know you were involved a lot in the development of the SCA. So could we start out by talking about how industry and partnership evolved during those middle years?
One really of the big things that I think about that changed was there was a change in ownership of the SCA. So the initial development of the architecture was done by a consortium, and that consortium, probably had maybe 4 or 5 companies that were members. So it was a very restricted group that had the real in-depth knowledge about the architecture framework and the material that was going to go into subsequent releases as the architecture, as the framework was being developed. Once that ownership changed, then it went over to the government, and really any of those competition specific type of aspects that were associated with SCA started to disappear, and there was an opening of the material and the sausage making behind the SCA to go to additional vendors and providers. It was still a lot of that access and material was a little bit restricted still, but it really expanded the scope of who was able to participate. Also, as we're going from early phases of SCA to the middle type of things, we transitioned the process away from architecture development and validation to something that was a finished and finalized product that was ready for production. As that transition was made, then the participation in the architecture development teams also changed. So that participation went to more of a voluntary model, as opposed to one that was really driven by contractual obligations for people to participate. And I think that when that model changed, there was a little bit of the nature of the participation changed also. So, people really had a stake in the development and the maturation of the framework. And that first group was very committed to getting something up and working. And I think the second group was passionate to getting the framework from something that just existed to something that worked well within the bounds of the products that they were developing. And really lastly, as the JTRS organization and JTNC owned the spec, it started to expand the process of collaboration even more. So it went just from the members of the consortium to an extended set of consortium members, but also really the major prime contractors to more traditional, or not to more non-traditional, excuse me, type of participants. So companies that weren't embedded within really the infrastructure or the community of people that had developed SDRs, or people that had developed government products before. And also it sort of reached out, through collaboration with groups like the Wind Forum. It really opened us up to participating and exchanging ideas and thoughts with international organizations and companies as well. So, having those voices and participants really help the evolution and development of the framework.
Yeah, yeah. So it really expanded it in its scope to a more international flavor.
It did.
Yeah. Okay, so what refinements or clarifications to the SCA architecture had, do you think, the biggest impact on the real world deployments?
Well, my memory gets a little bit fuzzy here, but I'll try to call out a couple items, and I am gonna try to go in a sort of a chronological type of order when I think about these things, but I might mess up one or two. So one of the one of the earlier phases. Oh yeah, and I will preface something also that yes, we're supposed to be talking about SCA, but I'm going to talk about the SCA complex as a whole. So that combination of both the SCA and the APIs that exist. So if I go back and forth between the terms a little bit, just bear with me. But one of the first things, or one of the early things, was the removal of the API building blocks and the 7-layer model from the framework. The 7-layer model, I think that was something that was introduced into SCA just based on the networking background of the participants, and it was thinking about things from that traditional radio type of architecture, and not necessarily from the perspective of a software developer. So I think that would sort of tie back to the development and maturation and evolution of SDR as a domain. So it became much more programmer friendly. And the building blocks, it was good. It was a good approach to extend the capabilities and really the domain specific aspects of the SCA, but it was somewhat limited, and I don't think that it really achieved all of those goals and objectives of interoperability. So the at a very, very high level, the building blocks introduced individual capabilities, and those individual capabilities existed as single interfaces, and a development team could sort of mix and match some of the individual capabilities that they wanted and aggregate those things into the final API that they were using. So it ended up being something that was very, very specialized to the company or the organization that was developing that specific API. So it was good for the company that was developing the interface and their direct partners, but it was something that was somewhat limiting to overall interoperability across the scope of an enterprise. So once we sort of moved away from that mode, it was sort of a bonus to more of a universal uh, type of interoperability within the SCA community. A second type of thing sort of follows that thread of thinking about the APIs, but it was the introduction of the JTRS public APIs. And with the core of the SCA, it's something that really is a general purpose deployment and configuration type of framework. And it's something that exists within the scope of distributed embedded system, but it's not something that is specific to software-defined radios per se. With the introduction of those APIs, that was something that started to layer the SDR specific aspect onto the collection of specifications that had developed. So that was something, and also making those things public APIs really allowed that domain specific aspect to be shared across the community at large. And again, it's something that promotes interoperability and expanded the scope of what SCA product suppliers were able to to develop and share. Um, a third thing would be, I'm sort of going down the API thread, but I think, adding the radio specific capabilities was one of the things that started to make um, the framework more valuable and more usable. So the third item would be the introduction of the MHAL and its follow up, the MACH-B. So that's the modem hardware abstraction layer, I think, is the expansion of the acronym, and the MACH-B was the MHAL on-chip bus into the picture. So that was an API that addressed a long time criticism or critique of SCA, because the SCA in its initial phases focused on things that were going to be deployed on a general purpose processor type of environment. And the MHAL and MACH-B um, started to open the door for portability, and it expanded the scope of the architecture to cover or address topics that were created to waveform application code that was going to be directed towards processors other than GPPs. So looking at DSPs or FPGAs. Some would say that those two APIs were not an optimal solution for portability in the non-GPP environments, but at least it was something that did address some of the existing issues, and it provided a basis for someone to actually develop and deploy all of the aspects of a waveform application. And model all of those aspects of a waveform application within an SCA inspired type of approach. And the last thing I'd like to hit there would be the introduction of the component model. And depending on how one's going to bound the middle phase of things. Component model was something that was introduced as part of SCA4, but I think that it was an important thing in terms of expanding the accessibility and the comprehension of the spec, because that was an approach which addressed some of the a source for some of the ambiguity that existed within the specification. So there were, I think of the SCA specs as being relatively straightforward to understand, but if it might be one of those instances where if one was not involved in the development of all of the materials, you don't get the full picture of what all the elements are of the architecture and how they should be used. And what that introduction of the component model did was it took all of the key aspects or the key design elements within the SCA, and it decomposed them into separate locations. So you could look at those core aspects of the architecture, which were really the fundamental models that needed to be followed. And then there were other parts that looked at the implementation specific aspects of the constructs that existed within the spec, and it started to provide a roadmap in terms of what all of the rules and responsibilities would be for people that were developing those specific components within the architecture, and provided really a more complete and a more expressive picture of how all of the pieces would need to fit together.
Okay. So how was interoperability achieved then when organizations were implementing SCA so differently?
I think that really the thing that enabled the interoperability was the communication that existed. Even back at the period of time when the consortium was developing the SCA, there was a lot of communication that existed across the organizations that were interested in using SCA and were building SCA. In that those early phases, the development community wasn't really that large, so it was pretty e- easy to get everybody in a room at the same time to talk about challenges, opportunities, and such. And as the program matured and as some of those items that we talked about earlier in terms of the change of ownership happened, there was a continuation of having all of those meetings. And I think for a long time, the meetings were held on either a quarterly or a half-year basis. So there was a lot of conversation that happened and open technical exchanges that happen in those open meetings, and there was a good community of people that could exchange ideas via electronic means as well. Um, in addition to that, for those companies or those organizations that either did not get invitations to or were not able to attend those regular meetings, the JTRS organization, and then followed up by Jitnik, had a lot of communication or a lot of channels that existed between the government organization and the people out in the community, be those other governmental organizations, programs, other industry companies. And there were a lot of opportunities for people to provide feedback over to the JTRS organization, who would then, really extract the core ideas of what was being communicated and share those with the larger group that was actively developing the spec. Um, Following up on that theme of communication, there was also, and this really is another example of some of those alternate channels that exist, that there were a lot of parallel efforts that were going on, I'll say, in the SCA universe, that contributed to the evolution of the spec, and something that helped with the interoperability. And three of the uh, items that I can think of, one would be things that were happening. I guess it was the SDR forum at that time, but the things that were happening in the forum was one channel. There was a parallel to SCA specification that was developed in the object management group, where a number of people that you would not traditionally would have expected were able to get together and talk about things related to the architecture, could get together. And then there was a reference implementation called Aussie that was developed, and it was an open source product, and it was something that you know the there was a community of people that were able to download a reference implementation of a core framework, and they were able to play with it and use it and provide feedback back to that development team. So there were all of those sets of people that were able to build SCA or close to SCA type of products, and a lot of the comments and feedback that were developed in all of those type of branches of activity were things that were able to get funneled back over to the JTRS organization.
Did you feel there were any like breakthrough moments where you felt like you had turned a corner?
There were a lot of things, and I will go back a little bit to the early phases of the development of SCA. So that would, you know early phase, there was the introduction of shareable development kits into the consortium, and that extended consortium community. And that was something that um, started to, I'll say, make SCA development easier and more digestible to people. It wasn't just a scary spec where everybody had to start from scratch developing support products or elements related to the architecture, but they were able to go out and get something that would accelerate the pace and the velocity of their software development activities. Then, once we get past that initial phase into more of the middle phases of things, there was the availability of or the introduction of commercial products that were based on the JTRS standards. So there
Mhm.
were companies that were both in the US and outside of the US that went and developed things for sale, that people who did not have a connection with the JTRS project per se were able to go out and buy that leveraged the architecture and everything that had been built. Um, the third was when we started discovering that there was a significant use of the JTRS standards on a voluntary basis in programs that existed or that were started outside of the US of
Right.
thinking, hey, these are our countries or companies that were not getting paid to use this architecture, and I don't believe that they had any US government mandates to say for interoperability or things of that nature, anything that you try to share with us has to be consistent with this architecture. They just at maybe they went to a conference or maybe they read a paper or something about the spec, and they decided it was a good idea or something that they wanted to use that would help to facilitate their development of software-defined radios. So that was really encouraging. A
Yeah.
fourth item, similar to the expansion into other companies, or I'm sorry, other countries, or there was the occasion when we started to learn that SCA was being used in different domains. I mean, it was always our
Yeah.
understanding that SCA really wasn't something that was specific to SDR. I mean, I would think that the the term radio basically is probably not used at all, or if so, it's probably a handful of times within the document. But it has radio as part of the title. But we saw and learned. I think one of the early adopters or users were people in the robotics community, just saw it as a way to deploy software in an embedded distributed computing type of system or product, and they found that it worked for them. And the last item that I will throw out there is something that I will say might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but the fact that there were reference implementations, and one that jumps out to me is Red Hawk, that really starts to obscure or hide the fact that even that SCA is part of the framework or part of the core that exists. So it's something where products or where capabilities that are based on that standard just show up inside of products because they're good things
Yep.
and not necessarily because it's compliant or conformant with the SCA architecture as one of its core foundational elements. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing that that product was out there, and there were a lot of people in a large community that were using it, and they didn't know and they didn't care about the fact that it had SCA at its heart.
Yeah. The SCA is highly adopted, as you pointed to. It has more than 400,000 units deployed worldwide. It's an international standard used in defense, aerospace, increasingly in commercial, electronic warfare, and test instruments. So when you were working on the SCA all these years, did you ever think it would become like this, like the backbone for so many tactical and commercial SDR platforms?
Um,
I mean, you kind of alluded to that you didn't imagine that, but
I would say the quick answer or the short answer to that would be no. And yeah, one of the weird or odd reasons why I say no is probably because of the frame of reference that I came from or that I was in over those years, because I was part of the group that was involved with the development of SCA and API specs, and you know supporting the organization that was the owner and the eventual owner and developer of the SCA. So I was often inundated or embedded in a world where there were a lot of comments saying, oh, the SCA isn't working for me because of this, or the SCA is causing me problems because of that, or the costs are overrunning because of SCA. And I it was, if not an echo chamber, it was an environment where there was always a lot of conversation about why SCA couldn't work, or why SCA wasn't a very good idea, or why SCA was making lives more difficult, and not as much of a focus, or not as much exposure to the fact that there were that number of products that were being developed in accordance with the framework, and that were being fielded in accordance with the framework, and you know provided capabilities and devices that were actually out and benefiting the community of people that were the users that really needed to have that you know next generation advanced type of communications capability. So I it was a matter of always hearing this is bad as opposed to this is good.
right, you're part of the problem fixing team. So that's
Yes.
what your focus is. Just make
Yeah.
it better and better, and look at it now.
In part 3 of this series, we will look at the SCA now through Viavi's T-Rex.